So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm a big fan of the Cronkite School. I'm delighted to work with Gregg and a number of other people here on a number of different projects through the center. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And I also want to especially note that Gregg is a member of our Imaginary College and part of this sort of community of faculty members across campus that we're building to do all sorts of cool and interesting things. But I want to start by talking about the title of this talk, which I just kind of came up with off the cuff, but then felt like I had to justify since I'm going to be speaking to you for the next half an hour or 45 minutes. And this talk will be, by the way, fairly improvisational, and I'll occasionally repeat myself in weird ways, and that's all part of the experiment. Do not be alarmed. So news of the future, that's an idea that I'm going to frame in 3 different ways. But before I do, let me set out the groundwork a little bit and think about why that's important. You're all here training for a particular kind of profession. You're going to be reporters, editors, producers, curators of news, right? So presumably during your time in this major or getting this graduate degree, you're thinking about what news is, where you can find the news, how you can write the news, how you can sell the news. But of course, what we mean by news is not so easy to pin down anymore. The boundaries between the sources of information, the reporters, the editors, and even the publications have all started to get awfully blurry, maybe even erased. And the landscape of conversation, that vernacular that Gregg was talking about, has also changed. The question of who has a voice has changed. So if you think about Twitter, well, who are the biggest voices on Twitter? The biggest voice on Twitter is Katy Perry. You have to get down to the 35th item on this list before you find an actual news organization, CNN. And when I looked this up, CNN had an article about how Katy Perry now had 50 million Twitter followers. CNN has 15 or so. So if you look at web traffic, you have to go down to, well, the closest thing on the top 25, which is the only ones I looked at, this is just overall internet traffic to websites all around the world. The closest thing to a news organization on the top 25 is Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is, in a lot of ways, the antithesis of what you're training to be. It's completely crowdsourced, no official qualifications required, grassroots journalism. Or is it? I mean, maybe it's not. Maybe it's something else. Maybe Wikipedia isn't producing news. Maybe Wikipedia is producing knowledge. What's the difference between news and knowledge? But of course, what's interesting about this list is not just this obvious piece of information that you already knew, which is that Google and Facebook are more popular than CNN or the New York Times. What's interesting is the fact that you're probably still getting a lot of news or information from these sites, right? You're getting your news feed from Facebook. You're getting your news from YouTube or Yahoo. You're watching video clips. You're following links and recommendations. But those pieces of information are being curated by your friends, by colleagues, by people who are somehow in your networks, or they're being curated by Facebook and YouTube and Google, right? These companies that are assessing you and making judgments about who you are and what you might click on, what you might be interested in, and then serving you up the news that you want to hear. One of the most profound challenges I think we face now and will continue to face in the future is that we're getting so good at customizing the online world that we're starting to lose that sense of a public sphere, of a set of information that everybody knows and talks about. Google already customizes search results for each of you if you have a Google account. Is there anyone here who does not have a Google account, a Gmail account, Google account? I don't see anyone raising their hand. When you search for something, you get something different than when I search for that same thing. Now, it might only be a slight difference. It depends on what the thing is, how specific you are, but Google will deliver to you the information that it thinks you want to hear. Google now thinks that I have, speaking of sports teams, Google now thinks I have a keen interest in some hockey team called the Ducks, because my 2-year-old daughter, whenever she sees a cell phone, she says, "Pictures of ducks, pictures of ducks." And so we look for pictures of ducks, and we've looked for pictures of ducks hundreds of times now. And Google says, "Oh, you must really be into the Ducks." So what we're living in now is a world where the boundary line between reporter and private citizen, between editor and public relations manager is more blurry than it ever has been. And this is one of my favorite examples. If you ask any of your professors here if they ever thought that a classic, traditional 20th century institution like the Egyptian Armed Forces would ever start using Facebook as their primary means of communicating with the world, they would say no, right? And this is how they have 2.5 million likes. They don't do press releases anymore. They do posts on Facebook. This is how they communicate with people. This was a product of the Arab Spring. I find this mind-blowing. And I am, as Gregg mentioned, a recovering journalist myself. So what I want to talk about today is 3 different avenues for thinking about this question of the news and our relationship to information. Try to imagine what the future might look like, how we could grapple with this not just as a set of changing variables that we don't understand now, but try to create a new set of stories and narratives around that. So let me talk a little bit about the Center for Science and the Imagination. Our mission is to get people thinking more, there we go, creatively and ambitiously about the future. That's a pretty broad mission. So on one level, we're a research center at a university, and we conduct projects and we write grants, but we also try and engage in what we call radical partnerships. So we work with a number of science fiction writers, and we pair them up with scientists, engineers, scholars, journalists, people like Gregg, and we ask them to write basically science fiction of the present, stuff we could do right now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that project in a second. We work with roboticists and dancers and put them together to do things like the Emerge Festival, which I'll talk about as well. We try to get people to have a sense of agency about the future, to stop thinking about it as something that will happen, something that a bunch of people in white coats in a room somewhere are going to invent for us, something that Apple is going to unveil at their next press conference, and start thinking about the future as a spectrum of possibilities, as a range of choices that we are all making, whether we think about it or not. Every time we get into our car or type in a search address in Google, we're making little decisions, little adjustments into that future world that we're all going to inhabit. And so if we just accept the default, if we just ride it out and wait for the future to arrive like we're on some kind of train, then we're not going to have a lot of choice about what that world looks like. We're going to accept a world. But if we can imagine it first, if we can come up with a set of stories, and they can be utopian and dystopian and everything in between, if we can come up with a set of stories that change our mind about the future, that create a possible world that we can inhabit collectively, come up with stories that we can believe in, then we can start building towards that future. And that's the core mission of the center, is to start creating those pathways. And they can be pathways for high school students in engineering classes, pathways for professional writers or professional journalists, pathways for all sorts of thinkers to try and give everybody access to this notion of the imagination. So it doesn't really matter whether you're a physicist or a sculptor or a writer. You need the imagination, that faculty, that core energy, that drive of the imagination to do what you do, to be passionate, to be good at what you do. So let me talk a little bit more about Project Hieroglyph. And this is an effort to bring a number of well-known science fiction writers together with scientists, engineers, and other researchers. And our ambition is to create a set of stories that will drive real innovation, but also open up the space and get people thinking a little differently about the future. So, for example, Neil Stephenson, who's this bearded gentleman here on the left, is a well-known science fiction writer and also historical fiction writer and other genres as well. And he came to this project, and he's the founder of Project Hieroglyph, by the way. He came to this project with a question, an idea, a thought that was nagging at him, and he found this structural engineer at ASU, a guy named Keith Jelmstadt. And so Neil asked Keith how tall could we build something? You're a structural engineer, you work on buildings all the time, you must know the answer to this. And Keith's response was, well, I've been doing this for 25 years and nobody's ever asked me that, right? So immediately he was intrigued because he could see how this question got him excited, and he could see how this question got his students excited and his faculty colleagues excited, because it wasn't a question you could answer by turning to chapter 2 of your structural engineering textbook, which, by the way, Keith had written. You had to do something more holistic. You had to do something more complicated and messy, and you had to go talk to people in other fields, you know, maybe political science or sustainability or physics, to start asking and answering questions like, well, what would we build it out of? Well, what if we built it out of steel? What if we don't imagine that it's made out of some impossible nanomaterial? What if we use real technologies that exist today and real materials that exist today? Well, how much steel would it take? Where would that steel come from? Would you mine it? Would you ship it over land, over sea? And so let me show you a little video that we made laying out this particular question just as a kind of teaser for the project. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the ways in which this story illustrate a broader kind of writing, a broader kind of imaginative project that we're working on. Let's see if this will work. Oh, that didn't work at all. So that's not right. I don't hear any sound. Chris, do you think you can get sound? Should I try again?
Anyway, let's start.
Let me just start this video again from the beginning.
Imagine if we asked ourselves, how tall can we go? What does tall mean anyway? Let's start with the 1992 Olympic Dream Team. Okay, wait, let's actually start with just Patrick Ewing, because his nickname was the Monster, so he's tall. He's 7 feet tall, which I guess is 2.15 meters for those keeping track. Let's put him next to the Statue of Liberty. That's tall. Even if we stack up a whole team of Patrick Ewings, it doesn't even touch the top of the Statue of Liberty. Okay, so let's put the Statue of Liberty next to the Eiffel Tower, because that's made by the same person. And the Eiffel Tower, at one point, was the tallest construction in the world. It was a while ago. And then let's take the Eiffel Tower and put it next to all of the tall buildings that we've built. Okay, that's tall. That's really tall. Let's look at Mount Everest. That's 9 kilometers. Let's look at where planes are flying. That's 12 kilometers. Okay, that is 15 kilometers. That is really tall. How many Patrick Ewings is that? 7,030 Patrick Ewings. That's really tall. What about a tower so tall that the stratosphere is just an elevator ride away? Challenges like this one stretch the boundaries of human ambition and exploration. They ask us to think big, and they are the heart of Hieroglyph, a collaborative project at the Center for Science and the Imagination. Neil Stephenson, a science fiction author, and Keith Jomstad, an engineer, came up with this moonshot idea for the tall tower. See what else we imagine at hieroglyph.asu.edu.
So what's great about Hieroglyph is that it invites everybody into the conversation. So Neil Stephenson started talking to Keith Jomstad about this idea. So Keith started doing some calculations. He put some stuff into MATLAB, and he created these models for the tower and figured out how much stress would be added and how wide the base should be. And he started working around these ideas of something that was maybe 20 miles high. Is that right? No, 20 kilometers. But the numbers kind of go up and down depending on how they feel about the jet stream, which is a serious problem for building something 20 kilometers tall. And So he was talking to Keith Jelmstott, but for example, this question of the jet stream came up. And Keith said, I don't know anything about the jet stream. We need to go talk to some atmospheric scientists. The question of power generation came up. The question of sourcing materials came up. The question of the politics and the social and cultural impact of building a 25-kilometer tower in your backyard came up. Thinking about who is going to live downwind of this thing and what happens if it falls over. So as soon as we began to investigate this project, we brought in people ranging from expertise in aerospace to computer modeling, software gurus to graduates and undergraduates in a number of different fields, from the humanities to the social sciences to the physical sciences, and asking them different elements of this question, because this was a really complex problem. It's what's called a wicked hard problem, right? You can't solve it in only one part, and in fact, the structural dynamics and engineering components of it all interrelate. So if you add just a little bit of weight to the top of this tower, the entire structure adds weight exponentially. If you increase wind resistance, the amount of extra material you add to deal with the extra wind resistance and the extra stress that's going to put on the tower, that also has to increase. So what's really cool about Hieroglyph is that these conversations are not closed off, they're not conducted in private, everybody is invited to them. So if you're interested, you can go to hieroglyph.asu.edu and you can see some of the conversations that are going on and get involved. And our vision for the project is very much that this is a community. So some people hear this signal and they're excited about this idea, about this project, and they come to us and they're fired up and they start sharing questions and answers on the site. And as time goes on, we keep finding more of these people, and they come from a vast range of different backgrounds. And they include people who often cross over between different backgrounds, like Gregg or Cory Doctorow, who's a writer, who's an activist. Actually, I was sitting here on the stage with him about a year ago, talking about activism in the digital age. And Hieroglyph is also a book project. So the first outcome of this collaborative process is a book that's coming out with HarperCollins later this year. And we're calling it Hieroglyph Blueprints for the Future. And I wanted to give you a brief sneak peek at a couple of the stories that people have been working on. And I wanted to start with this one, particularly because of my audience and some of the things we've been talking about already. The future that we're dealing with when we think about the future of news is not just the future of infinite information or infinite connection. It's also this future of ubiquitous computation, right? I assume that you all recognize this Google Glass. Megan, I guess she may not be here. Oh, there she is. She's wearing hers right now. So one of our writers for this project, Carl Schroeder, is a really interesting guy who also does strategic foresight work. And so he brought together his interests in the near future, which as a science fiction writer is the very, very hardest thing to write about, and his interest in new forms of collaborative political work. So he's been imagining augmented reality in a story called Degrees of Freedom, but he's imagining it in a very hands-on way. So he's thinking about, in practical terms, what this might be like. Let's say you're looking to buy a house or looking for an apartment. He imagines an app called Nexity that might run on glasses, not so different from the ones that Megan has on, that would allow you to layer city planning data and projected traffic routes and other information about the urban landscape into your view, so you could actually see, oh, a new condo is going to be appearing right over there, or there's going to be a new subway line coming through here, or they're going to be tearing up the street for the next 5 years, and here's where all the foot traffic's going to go. So you can start to imagine these new kinds of relationships that we would have with our spaces as not just physical spaces, but data spaces. And I'm going to come back to that later as a question for journalists, as a question for reporters, what you do with that kind of information. So let me read you a quick sample of this, and then I'll talk a little bit more about where he's going in the story with some more interesting and ambitious visions of this future. So here's a quick excerpt about this house hunt. What are they asking? 1.5. Seems low, I wonder. He turned around and saw why houses on this street might be priced lower. 2 blocks away, his glasses showed the virtual wireframe shape of a condominium tower superimposed against the towers across English Bay. The Nexity app took data from plans registered at the city planning office and made them into a virtual skyline. The historical city, buildings now being built or renovated, what would or could exist here, all were visible through the glasses. Rob's Anthill plugin annotated the condo project with projected desire lines showing what routes foot traffic was likely to take from the project to the new SkyTrain line. It went right by the house. There goes the neighborhood, he said as he shut the car door. You don't want to buy here. But Dad, that tower's the only development. Had there been anything else registered in the planning department, it would be visible in Nexity. Now look at the traffic map. Condos are like cockroaches. Where there's one, there's bound to be more. So we can already see the traces of this. We can see it through all of the tools that we have kludged together to do the same kind of work, through things like Facebook, through a number of the projects that were featured here for the Knight Foundation Future of Journalism Awards, again, a little over a year ago. And I imagine as you begin to do research and think about what kinds of projects you might like to do, especially digital projects, you're going to find more and more tools to allow this. We're at this stage in our digital lives where our reach far extends our grasp. There are probably hundreds of really compelling ideas out there that we just haven't put together yet using technologies that already exist. And that's a really exciting prospect. And so I see this story and Google Glass is very much an effort to do that. And you can tell by the way Glass has been released and promoted that it's sort of an open platform. It's an unfinished tool. There isn't that much you can do with it yet. It can do a lot of things, but we don't know what to do with it. And so I really like this story as a way to start speculating in very concrete ways. Nothing in this story, in Schroeder's story, would really be impossible to do right now. If you got a few good programmers together, you could probably create an app like that, at least in a demo version, something that you could try out. And so that's really compelling to start imagining these alternate visions of the future that are not so far away. And that was one of the core constraints that we put on all of the writers involved in Project Hieroglyph. We said, you have to come up with a future that is achievable within one professional lifetime. So a young scientist, a young engineer, a young entrepreneur reads one of these stories and she says, you know what, I'm going to make this thing real. She should be able to accomplish that in the next 30 years, 40 years, something like that. And in Carl's case, I think even sooner. So let me talk quickly about one other hieroglyph story. This is a really interesting piece by Annalee Newitz. Any of you familiar with IO9, the website? IO9 is, I think it's part of the Gawker media empire now. Somebody can fact check me. Annalee Newitz is the editor, so she's a journalist and primarily a nonfiction writer. And IO9 is the site that focuses on the future, basically science fiction, technology, and science journalism. And so we asked her to collaborate in Hieroglyph, and she said, well, I'm not a science fiction writer, but I'm excited about this idea. So we said, well, why don't you write nonfiction set in the future? So Annalee came up with these 2 visions of the future city powered by solar energy, thinking about the sun as the ultimate source of almost all energy that's used on Earth, and how we can become more efficient. And so she started thinking about, after doing a lot of research and doing interviews and a lot of journalism work, talking to researchers at various universities, she started to come up with these visions of the city as a kind of organism, as a cell that does its own kind of photosynthesis. And so I really I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from the beginning of her essay as to start thinking about this. Driving in from the inland freeway, your car is a virus injecting itself into an enormous cell. No, it's not your imagination. The layout of the city really was arranged to imitate the structure of a microorganism. In the mid-21st century, they called it urban metabolic design. When you see the glowing yellow sensor notices by the side of the road, you've reached the outer membrane. Privacy laws don't always work well with environmental ones, which is why we have to have big, ugly signs everywhere to warn people we are using surveillance to make sure the ecosystems aren't ruined. Most of our environment monitoring tech can't be used to track people or cars, but there you go. We have tiny networked sensors for tasting carbon and water levels in the air, camera trapping the wildlife, and sniffing for chemicals. The sensors are too small to see or they're camouflaged, but sometimes you'll catch a glimpse of the spider and dog robots patrolling up in the hills. They rescue animals who've done something ridiculous like eat a sensor, but mostly they repair the network and keep people from tromping around off the paths. If anything goes in the ecosystems out here, we'll know about it in just a few hours. We've got over 2 centuries worth of data on the kinds of fluctuations in life forms you'd expect from wetlands and grasslands. If anything goes off the charts, we'll know. So this is in a lot of ways a classic science fiction story, but it's written by a journalist who approached it as a nonfiction essay, as a science essay. But it has all of those hallmarks. There's this great term from the study of science fiction called the novum. And this is what science fiction does really well. The novum is the new thing, the new idea. So when you watch Star Trek, there's the warp drive, there's the tricorder, there's the phaser. Those are all different nova, and each particular novum has a special function. It takes a world, so when you're reading one of these stories or watching one of these movies or TV shows, for a while everything seems relatively normal. It's like life as we know it. And then the first novum appears, and there's this moment of what the critic Darko Subin calls cognitive estrangement, right? So all of a sudden, you realize that you're not in Kansas anymore. And science fiction is really effective at doing that and connecting us to that future world. So making it just strange enough so that we know it's not our world, but it's a world that we can still imagine living in. For Annalee Newitz, it's still San Francisco. It's still this future city, and we understand what cities are, and we understand what cars and highways are, but there are these sensors and robots and just enough difference to start pushing us to think about what the city should be like, what we expect and why we expect it, and what we should expect. So Hieroglyph is a project that's very much in beta, and we actually put that up on the website. And it's underway, and we're just now beginning to explore what the next iterations of it be, the next chapters might be, because we've done this book project, and we think of that very much as the beginning, not the end. And we're starting to think about other kinds of media forms. We're thinking about maybe doing a series of stories around the future of water and energy in the Phoenix Valley, and starting to think about what life is going to be like here in 30 years or 50 years. And we're thinking about doing stories that, in collaboration with a number of other government agencies and nonprofit, different organizations, to create this sense of collaborative future making that invites people in, right? So you tell stories that actually include your reader in a co-creative process. And so from the journalism perspective, Hieroglyph is not about objective reporting, right? It's about this kind of imaginative, collaborative storytelling. So you're inviting people in to tell the story with you, to buy into it, to make it better. So let me turn now to the second of the 3 things I wanted to tell you about, and I'll do this more quickly. One of the things that I'm really interested in my research is what some people call algorithmic culture. So thinking about companies like Google, how are we learning to live with these new systems? And these systems are often collaborative systems, but they can sometimes be very authoritarian systems. How we engage with these new forms of digital culture. So as a way to set this up, I recently read about the launch of this ultra-secure phone, a response to Edward Snowden and the idea that the NSA is tracking our every move, a phone to protect your privacy. And then on the other hand, this clip-on camera, I think it's called Narrative, that takes a picture of everything you do at 30-second intervals, right? So we're at this phase, you think about Google Glass versus encrypting your hard drive so nobody can ever read it. We're at this really uncertain, complex place in terms of our relationship with data. It's more complicated, more contradictory than it's ever been. And our debates on the subject almost always end up centering on privacy. But privacy, that notion that only you should ever be able to control information about yourself, cloaks a deeper tension between information and meaning, between databases and insights. And what I find really interesting is that we've begun systematically outsourcing vital chapters of our personal narratives. The most shocking thing about the fact that Target might know that you're pregnant before your parents find out is not the surveillance. It's that our digital breadcrumbs are telling stories about us that are deeply secret, moving, surprising, and often things that we don't even know ourselves. These days, when a computer crunches the numbers and it tells you this is who you are based on your search history or your shopping history, it's hard to contradict that computer because there's probably more data about you in the machine than there is in your head. Algorithms are most effective at curating the information that's hardest for us to keep track of, the metadata of minutia. How long you talk to your parents, how long you talk to mom on the phone, or what day of the week you buy an extra cookie, how long your commute is. Algorithms are really good at curating all of that, and that, of course, metadata is what the NSA continues to be so interested in. So the idea that a computer might know you better than you know yourself may sound preposterous, but take stock of your life for a minute. How many years of credit card transactions and emails, Facebook likes, digital photographs are sitting on some company's servers right now, feeding algorithms about your preferences and your habits? Put it another way, how many phone numbers do you know? Do you know your best friend's phone number? Yeah, I see some people shaking their heads. What would your first move be if you were in a new city and you lost your smartphone? I think mine would probably be to borrow somebody else's smartphone, right? That's the level of dependence that we have on technology. So I'd get someone else's smartphone, and then I'd get Google to help me rewire the missing circuits of my digital self. But the point is not about inconvenience or even about dependence. It's about a more profound kind of identity outsourcing. If you think about the future of news, the future of the individual information consumer, what happens when important parts of me only exist online? So when hackers take over Matt Honen's Google account, Matt Honen's a reporter for Wired, they were able to compromise his social media profiles and plaster the internet with all sorts of horrible things that were said in his voice. But worst of all, they were able to remotely wipe his Apple devices. So he lost a year's worth of photos covering the entire lifespan of his daughter. So this was identity theft, sure. But it was a kind of identity lobotomy, right? It destroyed parts of his life that I suspect fundamentally altered who he is. He's a different person after that. It's not a question of just changing his passwords or buying a laptop to replace the one that had the deleted data. This is a more profound kind of invasion. Of course, horror stories like this are just one part of the picture. Most of us are not wrestling with identity lobotomy, but something more like adolescence, where our data is sprouting up in all sorts of weird and uncomfortable and awkward places, pumping out signals about us that we barely understand, much less can control. So consider micro-targeting, like that Target narrative, where political and advertising campaigns can refine a message for an individual voter with startling precision. The inferences that Google or Netflix or Amazon make about you, they can be privacy violations, but they can also be these identity problems. Our digital selves are out there, shadowing us. They show up at our job interviews, on our first dates, at loan evaluations, insurance claims. And many of those identities, those digital versions of us, exist on servers where we're distinctly not invited, right? We're not the people who have access to that information about us. That's information that's being curated and probably sold, or in government cases, it's not being sold, but it's being collected for reasons that have nothing to do with us and our agency. But of course, nobody here is about to hand over their iPhone or their cloud-based storage anytime soon, I'm sure. And so a lot of people have been embracing the algorithmically examined life. So here's a graphic illustration of what could happen to you. So life logging pioneers have been doing this for decades already, recording and curating countless aspects of their daily lives, and then mining that data for insights, often quite beautiful insights. So this is one example of the evolution of something that in its current iteration is that narrative camera that we saw before, but people have been working on this for a long time. Take, for example, this guy at MIT, Steve Mann, who's been wearing cameras like this since 1980. The mathematician and all-around genius Stephen Wolfram, who created Wolfram Alpha, put up a blog post a little while ago examining a bunch of the data that he had about his own life. So he's crunching all of this data on his work habits and travel and how much time he spends on the phone to establish a sense of his professional rhythms that's way more detailed, in some cases mysterious, than a human reading of his calendar or his email account could ever offer. So this, I believe, is a chart of when he emails people, right? And so you can see not only that there are patterns, but that the patterns change over time. And his reflections on this whole process are instructive. One of the things he argues is that life logging is an adjunct to my personal memory, but also it allows for an automatic computational history, explaining how and why things happened. Now, we may not always be ready to hear that automated computational history. So at least one Facebook user was served an ad encouraging him to come out as gay, a secret he had never shared on Facebook and he'd only ever told to one other friend. And as our digital selves become more nuanced and complete, reconciling them with the real self is going to get harder. Researchers can already correlate particular tendencies of internet browsing history with symptoms of depression. So imagine how far off we might be from a computer that says, I think you might be depressed, or a school administrator, or a family member, or a friend, or a coworker, or a boss who says, based on your browsing history, I got this email that says you might be depressed. So the ways that we confront these issues, we have to learn to embrace them, right? We're living in this world that we can't backtrack out of. We have to figure out what our new relationships to data are. Every year I teach a class here on the Tempe campus in the digital culture program on digital literacy and composition. And my favorite assignment each year asks students to write a short story or a poem using only phrases they gather from Google autocomplete. You know, when you start typing in a search query to your browser and then it gives you suggestions on what you might be looking for. And the things they come up with are really incredible. They come up with these, they write these stories and these poems that use phrases and questions that become more resonant because you know that thousands and thousands of other people typed them in. And so Google decided to put them on their list of top 10 things that it might be guessing. Why should I believe in God? Why should I keep loving you? Just as a couple of examples. You think about the fact that thousands of people type these things in, that the search box becomes this confessional, right? We have this new relationship with our digital tools that's more than simply information retrieval. Sometimes we actually want to send parts of ourselves out into the world. We want to invest some part of our emotional energy, of our anxiety, our fears, our hopes, our dreams into one of these systems, into one of these little things with a submit button on it. And that, I think, is the most interesting and intriguing part of all of this, our evolving relationship with these digital reflections of us. Marshall McLuhan, the media theorist, argued that media are extensions of ourselves. So when you listen to vinyl instead of CDs, that really will make you a different person, right? That it's more complicated. It's a deeper relationship than simply choosing one tool over another. But the brave new world of digital culture pushes us a little farther. Identity is not just about who we are now, the clothes we're wearing or the music we're listening to, but about a personal trajectory. It includes histories and scars and first kisses and dreams and ambitions and role models. And ultimately, it comes down to this whole confounded question of consciousness and thinking about this map of the world compared to the story that we tell about ourselves, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, which is the whole confounded question of consciousness, right? That we're always gathering these imperfect pieces of data and stitching them together somehow, holding on to these talismans, the photographs, the seashells, the ticket stubs, the stuff that we have floating around. So when we start depending on our computers, to get back to Wolfram, who said he likes this automatic computational history, When we start depending on our computers to explain how and why things happened, we've started to outsource not just the talking points, but the narrative itself, right? This is the difference between using Google to do some research for your story and letting Google actually write the story for you using one of those automated journalism tools that are now writing stories on things like sports. So the machines can be cruel, right? The algorithm that fired a warehouse worker because he missed one day of work when his baby was born. There are lots of stories like that. They can also be minutely insightful, like the fact that Netflix has broken down movies into 76,897 categories, so you can find exactly what you want. So another media critic, Walter Ong, once described the shift from oral to literary culture. And this was the moment when auditing something for accuracy stopped meaning reading it out loud, which was the traditional accepted way to see if something was for real. And auditing started to mean you were going to pore over the books. You can put on your green visor and read things really closely. And now, from fields like legal discovery to the flash crash in Wall Street, it looks like we're doing another kind of shift like that. So before we went from oral to literary culture, and now we're going from analog to digital culture, where data is the ultimate yardstick. So in history, in business, in love, in life, the person or the machine who tells the story holds the power. This is why you're all here, I'm going to assume. So we need to keep learning how to read and write in these new languages to start really seeing these shadow versions of ourselves and recognizing their power over us. Maybe we can even start to get them on our side. And so that brings me to the last thing, the future of me. And I'll do this quickly because I've already talked too much. So this is the event that Gregg mentioned. It's going to be a lot of fun. You should absolutely come. It's going to be a carnival of the future. And I'll just show you a couple of videos. So these are just some slides from some folks at the Biodesign Institute who are doing a project on the future of personalized medicine. Imagine that at birth your genome is sequenced, and then forever after, disease prevention, detection, treatment, it's all customized specifically for you with all sorts of continuous health feedback and wearables and devices. And let me show you another project. This is something I'm quite excited about. This is a collaboration with the sound artist and musician David Rothenberg, where he's teaching drones to sing. Let's see if this will, I have to do this in this awkward way. Let's see. I may not be able to play this for you anyway.
What do you do when you want to use a video from YouTube in your PowerPoint presentation? The older versions of PowerPoint allowed you to embed the YouTube video directly from the insert.
I'm giving you the future of me right here. Let's turn that off and that one off and pause that. Fun fact, it's really hard to embed YouTube videos into PowerPoint. Okay. So this is just shot last week, an early rehearsal with the drones. I'm quite tickled by this. Oh, we got no sound. Oh, that's good. You get the idea. So the reason I'm closing with Emerge is that our theme is the future of me. So it's all about this relationship between the individual and the collective, whether we're heading for a future where Edward Snowden and Bill Gates can single-handedly change the world, or whether we're all just tiny cogs in these massive networked systems, so complicated that we can barely understand them, much less control them. So let me stop here. I already saw we have a question, and let's take some time for questions. Do you have a hand?
All right. Maybe I missed the introduction. Are they reacting to the saxophone itself?
I At this stage, they're being piloted by human pilots. So they're actually going to have their own voices. So Rothenberg wrote a script for them. And so they're going to be, and then there's a band, a Phoenix band called There Is Danger. Let me make sure I got that right.
The helicopters are going to have their own voices.
Yeah, the drones will have voices and speak in this kind of improvisational, collaborative performance with Rothenberg and this live band.
Cool.
Well, we have time for about a couple more questions.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Get this out of here. Yeah, other questions?
You mentioned that as this information sharing accelerates, we cannot backpedal. We just have to learn to accept it. I feel like that's a conclusion that you come to, or opinion that you've made. What do you base that on? And is it possible to step back? Or if you look at all of science fiction to where technology gets too strong and there's a whole offshoot or a collapse?
Well, I base the conclusion on history. The people, the forces of stasis have never succeeded, right? We inevitably end up moving forward, for better or for worse. So there's two sides to that. One side is that we've been successfully extending the human lifespan. We have these incredible technologies for creating and distributing food. We've solved a lot of problems. People like Bill Gates are out there, Jimmy Carter are out there personally trying to eradicate particular diseases, right? Which is an inconceivable achievement. But on the other hand, as some colleagues of ours at the sustainability school like to say, you can't innovate your way out of problems that you innovated your way into, right? So it's not necessarily that the future is going to be this glorious problem-free world and that technology is going to deliver us from all of humanity's woes. So, but I think it's naive. But I think that position, the utopian position and the dystopian position are both naive, right? We have to explore the spectrum of possibilities to try and find those pathways through. So I don't think that, so you kind of hinted there that maybe there'd be this general collapse. I hope that doesn't happen. A lot of people would die and it would be really terrible. And I'd like to believe that it doesn't have to happen, right? That there are ways for us to become more thoughtful and to develop a new sense of so when you start thinking about the future of me and the relationship of the individual to this kind of a society, it requires thinking through new questions of rights, right? And obligations and responsibilities, and what those things mean in a digital world. So I think that to really figure this out, you have to grapple with all of the hard things and recognize that there's no going back. So we have to find the just and thoughtful way to move forward.
Any more questions?
Do you want to have another question, another crack at this drone business?
Jesus. I don't know. I mean, I could literally ask you like questions all day about things, minorly related. I suppose I just want to pick your brain. So.
Well, I'm here for another few minutes. Can you distill that emotion into one single question?
What's the coolest project you personally are working on right now?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have a really fun job. I really like my job. I basically got to make it up, and that's a rare and special opportunity. Well, there's one project I'm really excited about that would try to, and this is actually much nerdier than a lot of the stuff that we do, but say, well, how could we find great ideas in science fiction that might now be real research questions? So we were funded to NASA funded us to run a workshop to actually explore that question. What's the relationship between literature, the arts, and real technological innovation? Could you do some combination of having experts in science fiction and different technical fields and algorithms sifting through novels or movies or other cultural material to say, here, somebody had this crazy idea 70 years ago that now might just be possible with current bioengineering. Or maybe, and I think maybe more plausibly, here's a set of 5 technologies that that this writer connected together to create this transformative new system for, distributing food. And now all of those technologies are real or achievable, but nobody's ever thought of putting them together in that way. So I'm really excited about that project. Right now, that's the big question. How would we find them? So we're not doing it yet. We're just speculating, but saying, where would we look for them and how would we identify them? Yeah. I think that, technically you can find ideas, you can find keywords. There's a lot of work in computer science to do stuff like that. So it's really a question of finding good ones and clearing that noise. The problem with this is not that you get too many, or not that you get too little, but that you get too much. And so you have to figure out ways to rank things to say, okay, well, here's a really good idea, as opposed to, this is a bad one. And then the other problem is people reinvent things all the time. Newton and Leibniz both invented calculus. People invented sonar in like 5 different places. So how do you deal with that problem when they call them different things, or people who imagine the same innovation 100 times using different words at different times in history? Yeah. Anyone else? All right. Anyone else have another question? All right. This guy's on fire. Yeah.
I don't know. Just a thought on that. Have you thought about looking to mythology or magic instead of just science fiction?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of different realms. So it's not just exclusively science fiction. We could be looking at other materials as well. We could be looking at all sorts of stuff, from technical documents and patent filings to scripts. We could look at advertising, right? Advertising is actually this really rich source of imagination about the future, because people are trying to tell you that if you buy this product, then your whole world is going to change. So there are all sorts of different areas where we could look for ideas. And at this stage, so you just asked me what the coolest thing I'm working on is. So this is very early stages for us. Yeah.
All right, and we're all out of time.
Thank you so much.